Chapter 9 of Sylvia's Lovers by Elizabeth Gaskell. This Librivox recording is in the public domain. Read by Terence Callan. Chapter 9. The Specksioneer. A few days after, Farmer Robson left Haytersbank betimes on a longish day's journey to purchase a horse. Sylvia and her mother were busied with 100 household things, and the early winter's evening closed in upon them almost before they were aware. The consequences of darkness in the country even now are to gather the members of a family together into one room, and to make them settle to some sedentary employment. And it was much more the case at the period of my story, when candles were far dearer than they are at present, and when one was often made to suffice for a large family. The mother and daughter hardly spoke at all when they sat down at last. The cheerful click of the knitting needles made a pleasant home sound, and in the occasional snatches of slumber that overcame her mother, Sylvia could hear the long rushing boom of the waves down below the rocks, for the Haytersbank gully allowed the sullen roar to come up so far inland. It might have been about 8 o'clock, though from the monotonous course of the evening it seemed much later, when Sylvia heard her father's heavy step cranching down the pebbly path. More unusual, she heard his voice talking to some companion. Curious to see who it could be, with a lively instinctive advance towards any event which might break the monotony she had begun to find somewhat dull, she sprang up to open the door. Half a glance into the gray darkness outside made her suddenly timid, and she drew back behind the door as she opened it wide to admit her father and Kinraid. Daniel Robson came in bright and boisterous. He was pleased with his purchase, and had had some drink to celebrate his bargain. He had ridden the new mare into Monkshaven, and left her at the smithy there until morning to have her feet looked at, and to be new shod. On his way from the town he had met Kinraid, wandering about in search of Haytersbank Farm itself, so he had just brought him along with him, and here they were, ready for bread and cheese and aught else the mistress would set before them. To Sylvia the sudden change into brightness and bustle occasioned by the entrance of her father and the specksioneer was like that which you may effect any winter's night when you come into a room where a great lump of coal lies hot and slumbering on the fire. Just break it up with a judicious blow from the poker, and the room, late so dark and dusk and lone, is full of life and light and warmth. She moved about with pretty household briskness, attending to all her father's wants. Kinraid's eye watched her as she went backwards and forwards, to and fro, into the pantry, the back kitchen, out of light into shade, out of the shadow into the broad firelight, where he could see and note her appearance. She wore the high-crowned linen cap of that day, surmounting her lovely masses of golden-brown hair, rather than concealing them, and tied firm to her head by a broad blue ribbon. A long curl hung down on each side of her neck, her throat rather, for her neck was concealed by a little spotted handkerchief, carefully pinned across at the waist of her brown stuff gown. How well it was, thought the young girl, that she had doffed her bedgown and linsey-woolsey petticoat, her working dress, and made herself smart in her stuff gown when she sate down to work with her mother. By the time she could sit down again, her father and Kinraid had their glasses filled and were talking of the relative merits of various kinds of spirits. That led on to tales of smuggling, and the different contrivances by which they or their friends had eluded the preventive service, the nightly relays of men to carry the goods inland, the kegs of brandy found by certain farmers whose horses had gone so far in the night that they could do no work the next day, the clever way in which certain women managed to bring in prohibited goods, In fact, that when a woman did give her mind to smuggling, she was more full of resources and tricks and impudence and energy than any man. There was no question of the morality of the affair. One of the greatest signs of the real progress we have made since those times seems to be that our daily concerns of buying and selling, eating and drinking, whatsoever we do, are more tested by the real practical standard of our religion than they were in the days of our grandfathers. Neither Sylvia nor her mother was in advance of their age. Both listened with admiration to the ingenious devices, and acted as well as spoken lies that were talked about as fine and spirited things. Yet if Sylvia had attempted 1/10 of this deceit in her everyday life, it would have half broken her mother's heart. But when the duty on salt was strictly and cruelly enforced, making it penal to pick up rough, dirty lumps containing small quantities that might be thrown out with the ashes of the brine houses on the high roads, when the price of this necessary was so increased by the tax upon it as to make it an expensive, sometimes an unattainable luxury to the working man, government did more to demoralize the popular sense of rectitude and uprightness than heaps of sermons could undo. And the same, though in smaller measure, was the consequence of many other taxes. It may seem curious to trace up the popular standard of truth to taxation, but I do not think the idea would be so very far-fetched. From smuggling adventures it was easy to pass on to stories of what had happened to Robson, in his youth a sailor in the Greenland seas, and to Kinraid, now one of the best harpooners in any whaler that sailed off the coast. "There's 3 things to be afeared on," said Robson authoritatively. "There's to ice, that's bad. There's dirty weather, that's worse. And there's whales theirselves, as is to worst of all. Leastways they was in my days. To darned brutes may a larnt better manners sin. When I were young, they could never be got to let theirselves be harpooned without floundering, and making play with their tails and their fins, till to say were all in a foam, and to boats' crews was all o'er with spray, which in them latitudes is a kind of shower bath not needed." "The whales hasn't mended their manners, as you call it," said Kinraid, "but the ice is not to be spoken lightly on. I were once in the ship John of Hull, and we were in good green water, and were keen after whales, and ne'er thought harm of a great grey iceberg as were on our lee bow, a mile or so off. It looked as if it had been there from the days of Adam, and were likely to see the last man out, and it ne'er a bit bigger nor smaller in all them thousands and thousands of years. Well, the fast boats were out after a fish, and I were specksioneer in one, and we were so keen after capturing our whale that none on us ever saw that we were drifting away from them right into deep shadow of the iceberg. But we were set upon our whale, and I harpooned it, and as soon as it were dead we lashed its fins together, and fastened its tail to our boat, and then we took breath and looked about us, and away from us a little space were the other boats, with 2 other fish making play, and as likely as not to break loose, for I may say as I were the best harpooner on board the John, without saying great things of myself. So I says, 'My lads, one of you stay in the boat by this fish,' the fins of which, as I said, I'd reeved a rope through myself, and which was as dead as Noah's grandfather, and the rest on us shall go off and help the other boats with their fish. For you see we had another boat close by in order to sweep the fish. I suppose they swept fish in your time, master?" "Aye, aye," said Robson. "One boat lies still holding to end of to line, t'other makes a circuit round to fish." "Well, luckily for us we had our second boat, for we all got into it, ne'er a man on us was left in the fast boat. And says I, 'But who's to stay by to dead fish?' And no man answered, for they were all as keen as me for to go and help our mates. And we thought as we could come back to our dead fish, as had a boat for a boy, once we had helped our mates. So off we rode, every man jack on us, out of the black shadow of the iceberg, as looked as steady as the pole star. Well, we had not been a dozen fathoms away from the boat as we had left, when crash! Down with a roaring noise, and then a gulp of the deep waters, and then a shower of blinding spray, and when we had wiped our eyes clear and gotten our hearts down again from our mouths, there were never a boat nor a glittering belly or e'er a great whale to be seen. But the iceberg were there, still and grim, as if 100 ton or more had fallen off all in a mass, and crushed down boat and fish and all into the deep water, as goes half through the earth in them latitudes. The coal miners round about Newcastle way may come upon our good boat if they mine deep enough, else ne'er another man will see her, and I left as good a clasp knife in her as ever I clapped eyes on." "But what a mercy no man stayed in her," said Bell. "Why, mistress, I reckon we all must die some way, and I'd as soon go down into the deep waters as be choked up with molds." "But it must be so cold," said Sylvia, shuddering, and giving a little poke to the fire to warm her fancy. "Cold," said her father. "What do ye stay-at-homes know about cold, I should like to know? If you'd been where I were once, north latitude 81, in such a frost as ye had never known, no, not a deep winter, and it were June in them seas, and a whale in sight, and I were off in a boat after her, and t' ill-mannered brute, as soon as she were harpooned, ups wi' her big awkward tail and struck t' boat in her stern, and chucks me out into water. That were cold, I can tell tha. First I smarted all o'er me as if my skin were suddenly stripped off me, and next ivery bone in my body had getten to toothache, and there were a great roar in my ears, and a great dizziness in my eyes, and t' boat's crew kept throwing out their oars, and I kept clutching at 'em, but I could na make out where they was, my eyes dazzled so wi' t' cold, and I thought I were bound for kingdom come, and I tried to remember t' creed as I might die a Christian, but all I could think on was, 'What is your name, M or N?' And just as I were giving up both words and life, they heaved me aboard. But bless ye, they had but one oar, for they'd thrown aught to the others after me, so you may reckon it were some time afore we could reach t' ship, and I've heerd tell I were a precious sight to look on, for my clothes was just hard frozen to me, and my hair almost as big a lump o' ice as yon iceberg he was a-telling us on. They rubbed me as Mrs. Theer were rubbing t' hams yesterday, and gav me brandy, and I've niver getten t' frost out o' my bones for a' their rubbin', and a deal o' brandy as I've taken sin. Talk o' cold, it's little you women known o' cold." "But there's heat, too, in some places," said Kinraid. "I was once a voyage in an American. They goes for the most part south, to where you come round to cold again, and they'll stay there for 3 year at a time, if need be, going into Winter Harbor in some of the Pacific Islands. Well, we were in the southern seas, a-seeking for good whaling ground, and close on our larboard beam there were a great wall o' ice, as much as 60 feet high, and says our captain, as were a daredevil if ever a man were, 'There'll be an opening in yon dark grey wall, and into that opening I'll sail, if I coast along it till the day o' judgment.' But for all our sailing we never seemed to come nearer to the opening. The waters were rocking beneath us, and the sky were steady above us, and the ice rose out of the waters and seemed to reach up into the sky. We sailed on, and we sailed on, for more days nor I could count. Our captain were a strange, wild man, but once he looked a little pale when he came upon deck after his turn in, and saw the green-grey ice going straight up on our beam. Many on us thought as the ship were bewitched for the captain's words, and we got to speak low and to say our prayers o' nights, and a kind of dull silence came into the very air. Our voices didna rightly seem our own. And we sailed on, and we sailed on. All at once the man as were on watch gave a cry. He saw a break in the ice, as we'd begun to think were everlasting, and we all gathered towards the bows, and the captain called to the man at the helm to keep her course, and cocked his head, and began to walk the quarter-deck jaunty again. And we came to a great cleft in the long, weary rock of ice, and the sides of the cleft were not jagged, but went straight sharp down into the foaming waters. But we took but one look at what lay inside, for our captain, with a loud cry to God, bade the helmsman steer nor'ards away for the mouth of hell. We all saw with our own eyes, inside that fearsome wall of ice, 70 miles long as we could swear to, inside that gray cold ice came leaping flames, all red and yellow, with heat of some unearthly kind out of the very waters of the sea, making our eyes dazzle with their scarlet blaze that shot up as high, nay, higher than the ice around, yet never so much as a shred on't was melted. They did say that some beside our captain saw the black devils dart hither and thither quicker than the very flames themselves. Anyhow, he saw them, and as he knew it were his own daring as had led him to have that peep at terrors forbidden to any on us afore our time, he just dwined away, and we hadn't taken but one whale afore our captain died, and first mate took the command. It were a prosperous voyage, but for all that I'll never sail those seas again, nor ever take wage aboard an American again. Dear, but it's awful to think of sitting with a man that has seen the doorway into hell, said Belle, aghast. Sylvia had dropped her work and sat gazing at Kinraid with fascinated wonder. Daniel was just a little annoyed at the admiration which his own wife and daughter were bestowing on the specksioneer's wonderful stories, and he said, Aye, if I'd been a talker, you'd have thought a deal more on me nor ye've ever done yet. I've seen such things and done such things. Tell us, father, said Sylvia, greedy and breathless. Some on 'em is past telling, he replied, and some is not to be had for tasking, seeing as how they might bring a man into trouble. But as I said, if I had a fancy to reveal all as is on my mind, I could make to hair on your heads lift up your caps. Well, we'll say an inch at least. Thy mother, lass, has heerd one or two on 'em. Thou minds the story of my ride on a whale's back, Belle? That'll maybe be within this young fellow's comprehension o' to danger. Thou's heerd me tell it, hasn't ta? Yes, said Belle, but it's a long time ago, when we was courting. And that's afore this young lass were born, as is almost up to woman's estate. But sin those days I have been o'er busy to tell stories to my wife, and as I'll warrant she's forgotten it, and as Sylvia here never heerd it, if you'll fill your glass, Kinraid, you shall have to benefit it. I were a specksioneer mysel, though, after that, or rather directed my talents into smuggling branch of my profession. But I were once a whaling aboard t' Ainwell of Whitby, and we was anchored off t' coast of Greenland one season, and we'd getten a cargo of 7 whale. But our captain, he were a keen-eyed chap, and niver above doing any man's work, and once seeing a whale he throws himself into a boat and goes off to it, making signals to me and another specksioneer as were off for diversion in another boat, for to come after him sharp. Well, afore we comes alongside, captain had harpooned to fish, and says he, Now, Robson, all ready, give in to her again when she comes to t' top. And I stands up, right leg foremost, harpoon all ready, as soon as iver I cotched a sight o' t' whale, but niver a fin could I see. 'Twere no wonder, for she were right below t' boat in which I were, and when she wanted to rise, what does t' great ugly brute do, but come wi' her head, as is like cast iron, a bang again t' bottom o' t' boat. I were thrown up into air like a shuttlecock. Me and my line and my harpoon, up we goes, and many a good piece of timber with us, and many a good fellow too. But I had to look after mysel, and I were up high into air, afore I could say Jack Robinson, and I thought I were safe for another dive into salt water, but instead comes down plump on t' back o' t' whale. Aye, you may stare, master, but theer I were, and main on slippery it were, only I sticks my harpoon intil her, and steadies myself, and looks abroad over to vast waves, and gets seasick in a manner, and puts up a prayer as she mayn't dive, and it were as good a prayer for wishing it might come true as iver to clergyman and to clerk too puts up in Monkshaven Church. Well, I reckon it were heerd, for all I were in them north latitudes, for she keeps steady, and I does my best for to keep steady. Indeed, I was too steady, for I was fast with t' harpoon line all knotted and tangled about me. The captain he sings out for me to cut it, but it's easy singing out, and it's no so easy fumbling for your knife into pocket of your drawers when you've to hold hard with the other hand to the back of a whale swimming 14 knots an hour. At last I thinks to myself, I can't get free of t' line, and t' line is fast to harpoon, and t' harpoon is fast to the whale, and t' whale may go down fathoms deep whenever t' maggot stirs in her head, and t' water's cold and no one good for drowning in. I can't get free of t' line, and cannot get my knife out of my breeches pocket, though t' captain should call it mutiny to disobey orders, and t' line's fast to t' harpoon. Let's see if t' harpoon's fast to t' whale. So I tugged and I lugged, and t' whale didn't mistake it for tickling, but she cocks up her tail and throws out showers of water, as were ice or iver it touched me. But I pulls on at t' shank, and I were only afeard as she wouldn't keep at t' top with it sticking in her. But at last t' harpoon broke, and just in time, for I reckon she was near as tired of me as I were on her, and down she went, and I had hard work to make for t' boats as was near enough to catch me, for what with t' whales being but slippery, and t' water being cold, and me hampered with t' line and t' piece of harpoon, it's a chance, missus, as thou had stopped an old maid. Eh, dear o' me, said Bell, how well I mind your telling me that tale. It were 24 year ago come October. I thought I never could think enough on a man as had rode on a whale's back. You may learn t' way of winning to women, said Daniel, winking at the specksioneer. And Kinraid immediately looked at Sylvia. It was no premeditated action. It came as naturally as wakening in the morning, when his sleep was ended. But Sylvia colored as red as any rose at his sudden glance, colored so deeply that he looked away until he thought she had recovered her composure, and then he sat gazing at her again. But not for long, for Belle, suddenly starting up, did all but turn him out of the house. It was late, she said, and her master was tired, and they had a hard day before them next day, and it was keeping Ellen Corney up, and they had had enough to drink, more than was good for them, she was sure, for they had both been taking her in with their stories, which she had been foolish enough to believe. No one saw the real motive of all this almost inhospitable haste to dismiss her guest, how the sudden fear had taken possession of her that he and Sylvia were fancying each other. Kinraid had said early in the evening that he had come to thank her for her kindness in sending the sausages, as he was off to his own home near Newcastle in a day or two. But now he said in reply to Daniel Robson that he would step in another night before long and hear some more of the old man's yarns. Daniel had just had enough drink to make him very good-tempered, or else his wife would not have dared to have acted as she did, and this maudlin amiability took the shape of hospitable urgency that Kinraid should come as often as he liked to Haytersbank, come and make it his home when he was in these parts, stay there altogether, and so on, till Bell fairly shut the outer door to and locked it before the specksioneer had well got out of the shadow of their roof. All night long Sylvia dreamed of burning volcanoes springing out of icy southern seas. But as in the specksioneer's tale the flames were peopled with demons, there was no human interest for her in the wondrous scene in which she was no actor, only a spectator. With daylight came wakening and little homely everyday wonders. Did Kinraid mean that he was going away really and entirely, or did he not? Was he Molly Corney's sweetheart, or was he not? When she had argued herself into certainty on one side, she suddenly wheeled about and was just of the opposite opinion. At length she settled that it could not be settled until she saw Molly again. So by a strong gulping effort she resolutely determined to think no more about him, only about the marvels he had told. She might think a little about them when she sat at night spinning in silence by the household fire, or when she went out in the gloaming to call the cattle home to be milked, and sauntered back behind the patient, slow-gaited creatures, and at times on future summer days, when as in the past she took her knitting out for the sake of the freshness of the faint sea breeze, and dropping down from ledge to ledge of the rocks that faced the blue ocean, established herself in a perilous nook that had been her haunt ever since her parents had come to Haytersbank Farm. From thence she had often seen the distant ships pass to and fro, with a certain sort of lazy pleasure in watching their swift tranquillity of motion, but no thought as to where they were bound to, or what strange places they would penetrate to, before they turned again homeward bound. End of chapter 9.